If someone were to ask you to name some of the greatest films of all time, there are some titles I imagine would appear on most people's lists. Films like The Godfather, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Alien, Blazing Saddles, Rocky, or Taxi Driver. Consider those films I've just mentioned, and you may have noticed they all have one thing in common. They were all released in America during the 1970s. These are some of the most instantly recognizable, quotable, and imitated films in the history of cinema. And if you are a fan of the horror genre, there is one movie from this decade that is often cited as the greatest horror film of all time: William Friedkin's 1973 masterpiece, The Exorcist. This is my favorite horror film of all time, and quite possibly my favorite film of all time, period. I can't think of any other film that has captivated my imagination as viciously as this one, at least to date. I watched the film for the first time in my mid-20s. Growing up in a religious community gave the film an air of danger to my younger, impressionable imagination. The concept of the devil gave me my first taste of existentialist dread. But as I grew older, I lost my faith. So I came to the film as a lapsed Catholic with no real belief in an afterlife. Based on that background, the concept of watching a film wherein the body of Christianity is center stage as protagonist and savior of the narrative should be at odds with my sensibilities and taste. And yet I love The Exorcist. The detail, the cinematography, the performances. I'm thrilled and shocked by it even 50 years later. And I'm certain my personal connection with Catholicism has something to do with my aesthetic attraction to the film. Now, when considering the time in which The Exorcist and all of these films I've previously mentioned were released, 1970s America, we may ask what was happening in the country at the time. Well,
my daddy rides that ship in the sky. My daddy rides that ship in the sky. Mama's not afraid, so neither am I. My daddy rides that ship in the sky.
this period of 20th century American history is known as the Counterculture movement. This period also saw the beginning of the Cold War, when instead of outright warfare between the United States and the Soviet Union, there was something of an intense culture war. The Cold War heavily invested in the cultural expression of the American way of life versus the Soviet communist way of life. This ideological sensibility had a hand in how communism would be portrayed in media. 1950s America began to develop a homogeny that had a particular set of rules and guidelines of what could and could not be depicted in its art. This was also a period in history that saw a violent crackdown on anything that would conflict with that projection. However, there are some areas of artistic expression whereby these repressive modes of mass cultural production could escape. Theatre, primarily Broadway. In the 1940s and 50s, when American films were still being produced under the Hays Code, Broadway began to see something of a golden age. Writers like Tennessee Williams, Arthur Miller, Eugene O'Neill, Edward Albee, and August Wilson were all writing plays about America as they saw it, which had its repercussions. Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman debuted in 1949. It follows the story of Willie Loman, an aging salesman who desperately tries to hold on to his idea of what his life should be. He has given his life to his profession to find that he is now struggling financially, and his sons are alienated from him as they do not want to follow in his footsteps. As well as being an examination of one man's tragic disappointment, I personally feel that the play is a biting critique of the reality of the American dream. Such a hot take, I know. Miller then wrote The Crucible, a fictionalized retelling of the Salem witch trials. Although the characters in the play were based on historical figures, there was a significant amount of poetic license in the framing of the narrative of the play. Miller wrote in the opening notes, "They believed, in short, that they held in their steady hands the candle that would light the world. We have inherited this belief, and it has helped and hurt us." This quote is about the Puritan society at the time of the witch hunts, but given what was going on in America at the time, it is certain that this hysterical finger-pointing of witch could easily be mirrored with communist. While Miller was tackling the hypocrisy he saw at the very top of society, Tennessee Williams was writing about some of the most taboo subjects in his plays: issues of homosexuality, promiscuity, rape, dysfunction in the family were all at the centre of his works, such as in Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, The Glass Menagerie, and A Streetcar Named Desire. As Broadway was experiencing this golden age, it wasn't long until these plays were being optioned for the big screen. In 1951, the film adaptation of A Streetcar Named Desire was released to huge success, earning its budget fourfold and winning 4 Oscars. It was a critical smash and led to a string of Tennessee Williams plays being adapted to film throughout the 1950s and 1960s, and like Streetcar, these works were often met with extensive censorship and alterations from the original stage material. Williams famously hated the adaptation of his play Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. The restrictions imposed by the Hays Code watered down the play's themes of homophobia and sexism. Despite these alterations, however, like Streetcar, it was another box office and critical success. After decades of the Hays Code imposing its morality onto the artistic expression of American cinema, it soon became clear that there was an audience who wanted more. Perhaps it is this desire that bubbled over into what would eventually become the countercultural movement. This trend of films that were willing to explore the taboos of respectable society and were also drawing in massive audiences seemed to coincide with the failure of more safe studio films in the 1960s. When films like Hello Dolly and Dr. Dolittle were failing to reconjure the success of The Sound of Music, another Broadway adaptation that shook the censors arrived in 1966. The adaptation of Edward Albee's classic play, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? One night after a faculty party, Martha and George return to their bitter and emotionally abusive dynamic. When a younger couple that Martha has invited over for drinks arrives, they are dragged into the searingly awkward and hateful mind games Martha and George subject each other to. The film and play became the latest in a series of cultural examples willing to subvert the inherent notions about the American lifestyle and to put on full display the ugly side of domesticity. So, through the examples previously mentioned of the plays that have been adapted to film throughout the 50s and 60s, I believe it is pretty easy to chart a rising sense of dissatisfaction with life in the United States. Despite the US government's attempt to rigidly keep the American people in line, subjecting political nonconformists and agitators to the blacklist and the scrutiny of the House Un-Americans Activities Committee, and despite the extension of this scrutiny into the film industry, the 1960s came to a breaking point, a point where the citizens of America vehemently rejected the norms of respectability and more conservative ideals of what American freedom and liberty meant. Now, if you've gotten to this point, you may be asking, yeah, okay, I came here for a video on The Exorcist, what's with the scenic route? Well, to try and bring us a little bit back into focus, the reason I have taken this detour is to try and contextualize the movement in American cinema that saw the production of The Exorcist and The Godfather and Taxi Driver, a movement now called the Hollywood New Wave. This was a period of cinema history when the major Hollywood studios seemed to be struggling with finding an audience for their films. But in 1967, 1 year after the release of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, one film would be released that would change cinema history forever. On August 13th, 1967, Arthur Penn's Bonnie and Clyde was released across the United States to both criticism from many, for its depiction of violence and its apparent glorification of the real-life criminals, look how far we've come there, to instant recognition as a significant milestone in the progression of American cinema. With the release of Bonnie and Clyde, the Hollywood New Wave was in full swing. The old Hollywood giants had to now transition into a period of experimentation, auteurism, and grit, a time when mainstream cinema in the United States could openly show the complex side of life in the 20th century, as the Broadway Golden Age had done so in the first half of the century. The violence depicted in films such as Bonnie and Clyde and The Godfather, the abandoning of conventional sexuality in films such as The Graduate and Cabaret, the struggle of living under economic forces such as in They Shoot Horses, Don't They?, Alien, and even in The Exorcist. The rigidity of the Hays Code had completely vanished to pave the way for a more unflattering portrayal of the world. Within 1 decade, the entire industry had changed. In that decade, many established writers, filmmakers, and actors had to adapt to this new era of Hollywood. William Peter Blatty had earned a living in Hollywood as a comedy writer throughout the 1960s, frequently collaborating with Blake Edwards, including a musical film starring Edwards' wife Julie Andrews and Rock Hudson. Called Darling Lily, the film was not a commercial success, perhaps because it was holding on to the success of previous musicals from just 5 years before. Admittedly struggling to adapt to the new wave, Blatty decided to take a sharp left turn and attempted to write a screenplay called The Exorcist, before receiving an advance from a publisher he was acquainted with, and the screenplay became the novel. Inspired by the case of an unidentified boy who is said to have been possessed, Blatty had first heard the story while studying at Georgetown University, which would itself become the setting of the film and novel. In The Exorcist, 12-year-old Regan MacNeil, daughter of movie star Chris MacNeil, becomes possessed by a demon. She begins to exhibit a number of strange behaviors, ranging from concerning to outright terrifying. The book was an enormous success upon its release and has since sold over 13 million copies. When considering why The Exorcist struck a chord with readers, it could be worthwhile considering the period of culture in which it was released. Surrounded by the discord of the counterculture era, the story of a young innocent child being corrupted by an invading entity into acts of evil could perhaps be understood as a metaphor for what was happening between generations of Americans, the generation gap. With the older generation seeing the values of the society that they grew up in being not only questioned, but violently rejected by the younger generation. And I do think this must have factored into the success of the book, although the concept of a young child being antithesized with evil has been a recurring trope even before William Blatty's novel. William March's 1954 novel The Bad Seed, which itself was later adapted to both stage and screen, tells the story of a young girl named Rhoda, who, despite her perceived innocence, is a sociopath who would murder a classmate over something as trivial as a penmanship contest. John Wyndham's novel The Midwich Cuckoos was adapted into the 1960 sci-fi film The Village of the Damned, and follows an English village whose women all fall pregnant after a bizarre, widespread case of unconsciousness. Their children, all of whom are born on the same day, grow up to develop powerful psychic abilities that they use to commit a series of bizarre murders in the village. And only 5 years before the release of Blatty's novel, Ira Levin's Rosemary's Baby was also released to enormous success, becoming the highest-selling horror novel of the 1960s, and as some critics have suggested, kicked off a boom in horror literature that allowed for the success of The Exorcist. When considering these examples, it becomes clear that the anxiety of the younger generation is a theme that wasn't unheard of in the horror genre at the time of The Exorcist's release. Perhaps then, there was another element at play in the novel that helped it to stand out to readers. Although Regan's possession is the inciting incident of the story, The Exorcist is really about a crisis of faith. After becoming convinced of the supernatural entity plaguing her daughter, Chris MacNeil uses her connections to arrange a meeting with Father Karras, an earnest and embittered Jesuit priest who has begun to question the worth of his role in society.
I think I've lost my faith, Tom.
The novel follows Karras' loss of his mother and fall into despair as he feels he had abandoned her. When she was living alone in New York, he was studying at different universities, becoming ordained, and taking a position in the church and university at Georgetown. This side plot involving Karras' mother speaks to a larger theme within the novel, existentialism. When I watched The Exorcist for the first time, I was no longer a believer. I believed then, as I still do now, that the idea of demonic possession was used as an explanation for a variety of ailments, both physical and mental, when the earlier scientific, medical, and pre-psychological spheres couldn't yet explain what was happening to a subject. So to watch a film where the protagonist was doubting his faith, as I had, struggling to make sense of a world when his worldview was cracked and shattering, as mine had, and even though this is, yes, a narrative where the devil and his demons do exist, as I don't think they do, it still evoked something in me that was easy to empathize with. How can one make sense of a world where such awful things can happen? Why do bad things even have to happen? have to happen? Why do we have to die? These are questions that I found myself asking when the answers I had were no longer sufficient, and William Peter Blatty was also interested in these questions. The novel contains several references to recent world history. Before the prologue, there are quotes from a wiretap conversation from the Sicilian Mafia talking about the murder of William Jackson, a gang member that they suspected of being an informant for the FBI. This is followed by another quote from Tom Dooley, an American physician and soldier, talking about the atrocities committed by communists. These two quotes are then followed by the names of three of the Nazi concentration camps: Dachau, Auschwitz, and Buchenwald. Blatty began writing the novel in 1969, the same year as the Manson murders that rocked Hollywood. How can there be a God in the face of what people can do to each other? The novel and film are both undeniably biased in the sense that it answers these questions with the established theocracy of the Catholic Church. William Peter Blatty was a student at Georgetown University when he first heard of the 1949 exorcism that was the inspiration for the novel, and he was a practicing Catholic for his whole life. For Blatty, the novel was a way of questioning the nature of evil. He distinguishes between two kinds of evil, the first being moral evil, the actions of people, hence the quotes at the opening of the novel. The second I will call metaphysical evil. He describes this metaphysical evil that moves in the world and causes pain beyond the control of people, such as illness and natural disasters.
Anyone who thinks for 2 seconds with the problem of evil. We're not talking about moral evil. We're talking about the physical evil built into the fabric of the material universe. Earthquakes, cancer, mudslides that swallow children, the tiny ecumenidae underneath the pretty lilacs in the lawns, devouring the bacteria, creatures, dog eat dog, the big fish swallowing the little fish. I mean, it's obscene, and it's very, very painful.
He also states that in symbiosis with this evil is the miracle of goodness, and this is the journey that we see Karras go on in the novel and in the film. If there is evil in the world as Karras sees around him, then there are angels in the world as well, which Karras learns in an act for his fellow man, trying to save this young girl. Blatty's utilization of these themes and ideas are, in my opinion, the reason The Exorcist grappled the imagination of the contemporary public as it did. The 1960s and 70s were a rocky time in the United States. The post-World War era brought about big questions to the West in its post-traumatic adaptation to the horrors of the 1940s, and these questions quickly found expression in the movement of existentialist philosophy, which was finding a growing popularity in the United States, particularly the works of French philosophers, including Camus, Sartre, de Beauvoir, and Foucault. The very question of good and evil famously became absurdly mundane in Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. Arendt's book was an account of the 1961 trial of Adolf Eichmann. Eichmann was a Nazi who was responsible for the transportation of the Jewish deportees to the camps across Europe, and he was a key figure in the formation of the final solution at the 1942 Wannsee Conference. He had then fled Europe after the loss of the war, but he was captured in 1960 in Argentina and brought to trial in Jerusalem for his crimes. In Arendt's account, the idea of Eichmann was more intimidating than the reality. She described him as someone who was not a great thinker, but someone who was simply obeying orders. It's pretty insane, and I highly recommend the book. However, there are some detailed descriptions of activities by Nazi forces, so do keep that in mind. But what the text ultimately demonstrated to society is that this great evil of the war was just people obeying orders. Eichmann is described as someone who used his position in the Nazi Party as a means of defining himself, even saying after the war, I sensed I would have to live a leaderless and difficult individual life. I would receive no directives from anybody. No orders and commands would any longer be issued to me. No pertinent ordinances would be there to consult. In brief, a life never known before lay ahead of me. Why do evil things have to happen in the world? Because those were the orders. So, culturally, there was a rising sentiment of existentialism and the sense that the meaning of life might not have an answer, so why are there such rigid controls over the cultural product of film? The Hays Code forbade the depiction of controversial subject matter in Hollywood. Subjects such as miscegenation, adultery, and homosexuality were strictly prohibited. This control had died by the time of the Hollywood New Wave, but it was in the preceding era of Hollywood, in the comedies and musicals of the 1960s, that Blatty had established himself as a writer before The Exorcist. His bread and butter had been escapist entertainment, but now, as the world and Hollywood were quickly shifting gears, Blatty found himself in the middle of the new Hollywood movement, with the success of the novel becoming a rapidly developing film project. Enter William Friedkin. The same year as Blatty's novel was released, William Friedkin established himself as one of the most exciting new filmmakers. 1971's The French Connection is an adaptation of the non-fiction book of the same name, and follows two NYPD officers who work to take down a heroin smuggling operation between New York and Marseille. Based on the real events of an actual drug smuggling scheme, the film's use of documentary-style filming lent a gravitas and reality even to the more action-heavy sequences, and earned Friedkin an Oscar for Best Director. It was this gravitas and documentary style that Blatty wanted for the film adaptation. Blatty understood that in trying to convey a story as bizarre as The Exorcist, an audience needs to be given a world they would invest in. Friedkin had received a copy of the novel when he was touring with The French Connection, and although he didn't initially read it, when he finally did, he said to have read the whole thing in one sitting. Blatty and Friedkin collaborated on adapting the novel, and this process is something that interests me when considering my feelings towards the film and novel. I personally find the film more enjoyable as a work of horror. I think that ambiguity is something that is essential to horror, and when I read the novel, having already watched the film, I felt that there were fuller explanations given to threads of the film's narrative, but I don't know if it necessarily added to the experience. For example, in the scene where Chris discovers the Ouija board and Reagan tells her about Captain Howdy, for a viewer who has not read the book, it plants a seed in the narrative. Who is Captain Howdy? Where did that name come from? But when you read the novel, there is a potential explanation. In the novel, we learn the name of Chris's ex-husband and Reagan's father, Howard. I will say that in the context of the novel, the reveal of Howard's name is utilized for a purpose, in the building of tension regarding the question of whether Reagan is possessed or if she's acting out as a result of her parents' divorce. The fact that the name Captain Howdy is given a logical explanation is a solid choice in the building of that tension, but film doesn't need to build this tension by saying so much with its exposition. The visual is used to convey information. In this transition between the two mediums, The Exorcist does become a haunting portraiture of despair. Friedkin axed much of the comic relief of the novel, namely Kindleman and side plots involving Carl and Willie and psychic neighbors. The central conflicts of evil in the possession of Reagan and grief of Karis's mother are enough to ask the viewer what the novel asks the reader. What is the nature of good? What is the nature of evil? I find myself relating to this central question of good and evil, and also despair. As a cautiously pessimistic individual, I have not found answers to these questions, and I don't believe there is a concrete answer. The Exorcist tries to provide an answer. The answer of good and evil is that it exists both in the world and in humanity. While we are powerless in the face of metaphysical evil, we can find relief in our humanity and actions for fellow man. And I would say there is a principle in this that I agree with. There's always going to be fear and hatred and darkness in the world, but to meander nihilistically is not a solution, in my opinion. It is in action that we survive, and we must learn to survive for ourselves and for others. As much as I love The Exorcist, however, I consider it to be a piece of conservative art. The novel is clearly influenced by Blatty's religious background, and while the film is slightly more nuanced, it does follow the same narrative structure and conclusion as the book. The child of a divorced single mother, a movie star at a time when Hollywood was undergoing the dramatic gear shift of the new wave, becomes possessed by the demon Pazuzu, and it is in the action of two priests who ultimately give up their lives to save her, portraying Catholicism as the savior. Based on that premise alone, readings of The Exorcist have been both praised and scathed by literary critics, film critics, and the audiences. Upon its release, the questions that the book and film raised certainly spoke to the zeitgeist. The brutality of the Vietnam War, the assassinations of Martin Luther King and JFK, civil disobedience in the fight of the civil rights movements, and the Manson murders had shattered the American ideals of the previous decade. The chaos of the time is represented by the chaos of Pazuzu, who interrupts the idyllic lives of Reagan and Chris McNeil, and it isn't until after they have exhausted all other options that Chris turns to the church to establish peace in her family life. One of my bigger concerns with films like The Exorcist is whether it promotes exorcism as a legitimate solution to complicated situations of mental health struggles. One of the most famous cases of exorcism in the 20th century, that of Anneliese Michel, occurred only 3 years after the release of The Exorcist. In 1976, 23-year-old Michel died as a result of a series of over 60 exorcisms that were performed in order to drive out the demons believed to be possessing her. After enduring these rituals, Michel succumbed to malnourishment and dehydration. After her death, her parents and the two priests performing the exorcisms were found guilty of negligent homicide. The genesis of the Michel family's belief that their daughter was possessed were a series of seizures Anneliese experienced from the age of 16. Although the Michels initially sought medical advice for Anneliese, the treatment of an antipsychotic sedative and an anti-seizure medication seemed to help very little with her condition, which now included depression and auditory hallucinations. She began to hear voices that were telling her she was going to go to hell. Her diagnosis concluded that she was suffering from a case of temporal lobe epilepsy.
We still think the temporal lobe.
Oh, what are you talking about?
What can be frustrating with learning more about the details of Anneliese's case is the quickness with which the medical was dropped in favour of a solution that came from the piety of the Michels' religious background. From the point of view of the Michels, who were devout Catholics, the auditory hallucinations telling Anneliese that she would rot in hell had a potentially metaphysical external source. One of the more controversial questions raised by Anneliese's case was the relationship of the state and religious freedom. Anneliese's medical and psychiatric issues began to manifest before she was legally an adult, and hers is just one of the more famous cases of exorcism in the 20th century, but in the years since her death, the practice of exorcism has still had a detrimental and fatal impact across the world. In January 2023, a North Carolina couple's 4-year-old son died from injuries sustained by his parents. It was later claimed that these were the results of an attempted exorcism, and in May of this year, the courts of Hong Kong tried the case of a 14-month-old child who died at the hands of her father's exorcism ritual. You really don't need to look far for examples of ritualistic abuse that is still a common occurrence across the world today. And although it is not the responsibility of a single piece of media to account for the actions of people in real life, the problem with The Exorcist is that it is firmly rooted in Catholic faith and institution. I would also like to acknowledge that the claim of exorcism in a trial may be a ploy to cover up what was really a case of abuse and neglect. The research that Blatty and Friedkin conducted in writing the book and making the film was heavily aided by Catholic Jesuits who had performed exorcisms or kept records of the cases that inspired Blatty's initial conception of the novel. Many of the priests in the film, pretty much all of the priests in the film not played by Max von Sydow and Jason Miller, were real priests who worked as consultants on the film. So, The Exorcist, in asking the questions of what to do about evil, whether it be in the acts of man's immorality or the metaphysical evil of man's place in a world that will decay and die, it tries to offer a solution. The miracle of man's act for his fellow man in performing this exorcism as a solution, as an answer to the question. But as much as it is not my place to say that a belief system is wrong, what is wrong is when that belief system results in actions that harms those it is proclaiming to protect. Yes, the McKells must have been at their wits' end watching their child suffer as she did. And when the initial treatments did not work, it is understandable that in the face of the complexity of human brain chemistry, stepping back onto a belief system that helped to make sense of the world would be where the McKells could look for a solution. It is understandable, but crossing the line into neglect becomes frustrating when you remember they performed over 60 exorcisms to no avail. How many times would have been enough for them? And in asking the question, is the film responsible for the actions of the McKell family? I would say no, the film isn't responsible, but the church is. It is the body that perpetuated the idea of exorcism for centuries up until recent history. So the fact that so many legitimate men of the cloth were involved in the film suggests the church was using the film as a tool of spreading the word of God in a gritty horror film that would become one of the most culturally influential films of all time. It was the last gasp of authority that the Catholic Church exerted in spreading its message before the decline of Catholicism in Western culture. Or as Pauline Kael wrote, "The movie may be in the worst imaginable taste, that is, an utterly unfeeling movie about miracles, but it's also the biggest recruiter poster the Catholic Church has had since the sunnier days of Going My Way and the Bells of St. Mary's." To a modern perspective, although The Exorcist is openly Catholic, there's still a lot for non-believers to become invested in. The themes of existentialism and how to deal with those feelings of dread are not unique to the film. It is simply a facet of the human condition. As I'm coming to the end of my analysis of the film, I find that when I compare The Exorcist to more modern films about existentialist dread, I understand why it has lasted as long as it has in cultural memory. Not everyone is Catholic, but everyone is human, and these are questions that have plagued humans since time immemorial.
I think the point is to make us despair.
But what dates the film is the social, political, cultural context in which it was produced, a context that was significantly more theological than today, a context that was at a crossing point between a conservative landscape and a landscape where more liberal-minded thinking was questioning the status quo and engaging in civil disobedience to make fundamental changes to society. And I think this is where more critical understandings of the film receive validity. In her review of the film, Pauline Kael accused both the film and the novel of being shallow, and that Blatty, like the pulp authors who provide flip-page sex, he provided flip-page torture, infanticide, cannibalism, sexual hysteria, werewolves. The book is a manual of lurid crimes written in an easy-to-read, tough guy style, yet with a grating, heightened word here and there, supposedly to tone it up. I will admit that there are aspects of Kael's criticisms that I agree with. I find that beyond the extremities of the novel, there was very little to keep me engaged, in particular the passages with Lieutenant Kindleman, which Blatty used as comic relief, I felt dragged the momentum of the story to a halt, and Kael's criticism of the novel as a piece of pulp writing did remind me of the tactic of hysterical propaganda the church used in its persecution of the heretics, the witches, the Jewish community, and in more recent times, the gay community. Look how far we've come there. In her book, Men, Women, and Chainsaws, Carol Clover explores the occult film in Chapter 2. She explains the occult film as the crossing of boundaries between white science and black magic, to use the terminology of the serpent and the rainbow. White science refers to Western rational tradition. Its representatives are nearly always white males, typically doctors, and its tools are surgery, drugs, psychotherapy, and other forms of hegemonic science. Black magic, on the other hand, refers to Satanism, voodoo, spiritualism, and folk variants of Roman Catholicism. Its inhabitants are black, Native Americans, mixed race peoples, especially Cajun and Creole, and third world populations in general, children, old people, priests, Transylvanians, but first and foremost, women. And that insofar as the occult film repeatedly elaborates the distinction between white science and black magic in racial, class, and gender terms, it traffics in some of the most basic social tensions of our time. And The Exorcist, as I have explained in exploring the social tensions and context of the point in the 20th century that it was made, is brimming with this tension. Karras, who is a member of the category of white science, as it is his experience with psychology that is an obstacle in his belief in the magic presented before him. He steps into the realm of black magic, and he becomes the protagonist, with the suffering of Regan and Chris being used as a means of letting Karras have his emotional arc. Certainly, the novelist's and filmmaker's target is not the female body, but the transformation that body prompts in the male psyche. For Clover, the exploration of this tension prompts her to ask, why is there such a vast representation in horror of women and themes of homosexuality, when it is a genre typically thought of as having a predominantly male audience? Although I don't believe that horror does have a predominantly male audience, at least not anymore. This focus on the female body as a means of prompting this transformation in the male psyche has some interesting theological implications. Regan is the Eve of the narrative of Karras's theological redemption. Without Regan, without the black magic, Karras would have potentially fallen deeper into the nihilistic spiral at the beginning of the story and left God, left the church. Although this definitely has a misogynistic element, it could be argued that this experience of interacting with the feminine is what enables the protagonist to achieve their character arc. It is also worth remembering, in relation to the gender dynamics of the Exorcist narrative, that the original 1949 exorcism case that inspired Blatty's novel was the case of a teenage boy, not a teenage girl. While I was writing this video, the trailer for Exorcist Believer was released. As a rule of thumb, I try not to watch trailers for films that I'm interested in going to see. I prefer to just go to the cinema with as little information as possible. But nonetheless, I have watched the trailer for Believer, and yeah, it looks like a pretty standard horror film. I've already come to the conclusion that it's not going to be anything like the original. I think that would be impossible. If there's one point that I hope I've made clear throughout my ramblings in this video, it is that the original Exorcist was a product of its time. It was responding to the ever-changing world around Blatty, Friedkin, and the church. And whether you believe the film is a piece of Catholic propaganda or a piece of thoughtful theological philosophy, or maybe you think it's a little bit of both, as I do, I think we can all agree that in the 50 years since it was released, we have moved speedily into a new theological and political milieu. Do I think that Believer will have anything to say about existentialism? I don't know. If there is a question I have, it is, how will the church be featured in the film? From what I can tell of the trailer, it seems that Believer is planning to incorporate a more multicultural perspective on the concept of possession.
Exorcism is a ritual. Every culture, every religion, they all use different methods. It's going to take all of them.
In more recent exorcism horror films, the role of the church has come into this strange middle ground.
Centuries of persecution and torture. The worst abuses of the Inquisition. All started by the Fra and done in the name of God. By the devil.
Oh, so it wasn't actually the church that committed historical atrocities, it was a demon. Right. I had thought about a sequel to The Exorcist and what that would look like in the 21st century, and I felt that one obvious route to take would have been to question the piety of the church and to address some of the issues around organized religion. In 2022, the Pope's Exorcist made a step in the right direction with this, and yet it came to some troubling implications. If the story is to be believed as based on actual events, then the church acknowledges that mental health disorders and psychological trauma are existing factors in extreme behavior, that there are those 2% of legitimate possessions, And these possessions can seemingly happen to anyone, since the Spanish Inquisition wasn't really committed by the church, it was a demon who possessed an exorcist, which kind of makes me question what the power of the church would be if they were just as susceptible to possession. And doesn't that also give the church an out for its historical abuses? How could we blame the church for the Spanish Inquisition when it was the action of a demon who was seemingly very convincing in getting the rest of the clergy to jump on the killing heretics bandwagon? It wasn't the church that did that, it was a demon. And the rest of the church. And if we can separate the church from one sin, we can separate it from another, and another. And I'm sorry for the tangent, but I just really disliked this film. So, as it stands, I am curious to see what the role of Catholicism specifically will play in the new Exorcist film. I'm assuming from the trailer it is going to play quite a large role.
God played a trick on you.
Am I expecting it to be as good as the original? No, I'm not. Am I expecting it to be good? Well, I don't know. I have had the feeling that exorcism as a subgenre of horror really has very little to say in the modern world. At least that's what I thought until I saw Talk to Me in the cinema, and that is a film that utilizes the concept of possession in some interesting ways. It was able to utilize possession as a metaphor for mental illness, grief, self-destruction, in a way that I resonated with. Perhaps not as intensely as The Exorcist, but I feel like if there was a blueprint of an idea of what a modern Exorcist film could explore, Talk to Me was it. And although the realm of exorcism and possession is usually tied to a religious tradition, Talk to Me presents a more secularized telling of the possession story, and in doing so, the directors are able to take the concept and use it to explore the dread of living with the human condition. And with rocketing rates of depression, anxiety, and mental illness, perhaps the concept of possession, which has historically been a religious belief, could now be understood in a more metaphorical context when expressed in film. I'm definitely going to see Exorcist Believer when it comes out, and I'm going to be cautiously optimistic. And who knows, I might actually like it.